You got out of bed this morning and reached for something on a high shelf or pushed yourself up out of a chair, and it took a little more effort than it used to. You've lost weight, maybe a lot of weight. The scale looks better than it has in years. But something else has changed too, and you can't quite put your finger on it. Your grip feels weaker, stairs feel steeper, and the number on the scale doesn't tell the whole story anymore. Most people on a GLP-1 medication like Ozempic or Wegovy have been told the same thing. Eat less, move more, watch the number go down. That advice isn't wrong, but it leaves out something the drug company's own clinical trials have quietly documented for years. Not all weight loss is the same. And if you're not paying attention to what kind of weight you're losing, you can end up lighter and weaker at the same time. Doctors have about 15 minutes with you at a follow-up visit, most of which goes to checking your blood sugar, your side effects, and your dose. There usually isn't time left to explain body composition. That's not a cover-up, it's a scheduling problem, so I'm going to spend the next several minutes doing what a rushed appointment can't. I've spent years working with patients on these medications, watching the same pattern play out again and again: rapid weight loss, real health improvements, and a quieter loss happening at the same time that almost nobody warns them about. Today, I want to walk you through what the actual clinical trial data shows about muscle loss on these drugs, and more importantly, the 5 things the research shows you can do about it, ranked from least to most powerful, based on how directly each one addresses the actual mechanism of muscle loss during rapid weight loss. And the number 1 item on this list isn't a supplement, and it isn't a food. Researchers who tracked patients combining it with the right protein intake found they cut their muscle loss from the 26 to 40% range down to under 10% of total weight loss. Let that sink in. The same drug in the same person can either eat away at your muscle or barely touch it, depending entirely on one decision. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments, how much weight have you lost so far on your medication, and have you noticed any change in your strength or stamina? I read every comment, and it shapes what I cover in future videos. Let's start with what the actual numbers say. In the Step 1 trial, one of the largest studies ever done on semaglutide, the active ingredient in Ozempic and Wegovy participants lost an average of about 15 kilograms of weight. Of that, roughly 6.9 kilograms was lean mass, not fat. That works out to about 45% of the total weight lost coming from lean tissue. Not a typo. Researchers have flagged this because it exceeds what's called the quarter fat-free mass rule, the old assumption that only about a quarter of weight lost during dieting comes from lean tissue. On semaglutide, for many people, it's closer to half. Now, here's the important nuance that most headlines skip. Lean mass isn't only muscle, it includes some water, connective tissue, and organ mass too. And a 2024 study called Semaglutide, which followed 106 patients on semaglutide for a full year using DEXA scans and grip strength testing, found something more reassuring. While lean mass dropped early on in the first 7 months, it largely stabilized afterward, and grip strength actually improved by about 4.5 kilograms by the 12-month mark. So this isn't a one-way street toward weakness. It's a window of vulnerability, mostly in the earlier months, that you can actively manage. Number 5 on today's list. Don't let this position fool you. This one is sitting in almost every kitchen in America right now, and almost no one on these medications is doing it correctly. Spreading your protein evenly across the day instead of loading it into one meal. Most people have been told simply to eat more protein. That advice, while true, misses the mechanism entirely, and it's costing people muscle they didn't need to lose. Your muscles don't store protein for later use the way your body stores fat. Muscle protein synthesis. The process of actually building and repairing muscle tissue gets triggered in short windows, and it needs a meaningful dose of protein, generally in the range of 25 to 40 grams, to properly switch on. If you eat 6 grams of protein at breakfast, 30 at lunch, and 60 at dinner, your body only gets one real opportunity that day to build muscle, and it wastes the rest. Think of muscle protein synthesis like a set of 3 doors that only open if you knock hard enough. A light tap, a few grams of protein scattered here and there, doesn't open the door at all. You need a firm knock at each door, spaced through the day, to get all 3 to open. Most people on GLP-1 medications, because their appetite is so suppressed, end up tapping lightly at all three doors instead of knocking firmly at even one. This matters more for people on these medications, specifically because of something called anabolic resistance as we age, and especially during rapid weight loss. Our muscles become less responsive to the protein we do eat, so we need a bigger, more concentrated dose to get the same building response we used to get from a smaller amount. Consider someone in their 60s who started semaglutide and, because food simply didn't appeal to her anymore, found herself eating a small bowl of cereal in the morning, a handful of crackers at lunch, and a modest dinner protein scattered so thin across the day that none of it landed with any force. Her earlier explanation for feeling weaker was simply getting older. The change that mattered wasn't eating more overall appetite suppression made that hard. It was consolidating what protein she could manage into 2 or 3 real servings, each with at least 25 grams, built around eggs, Greek yogurt, or a protein shake. Within a couple of months, her grip strength testing at a follow-up visit had measurably improved, even though her total calorie intake barely changed. Here's what this looks like tonight. Pick a plain Greek yogurt, thick, slightly tangy, cool from the fridge, and stir in a scoop of unflavored or vanilla protein powder until it's smooth. No lumps. That single bowl gets you close to 30 grams. Eat it slowly. On appetite-suppressing medication, a big bowl can feel like a lot, and that's fine. This is about landing one firm knock on the door, not forcing down more food than feels comfortable. Pair this with a source of vitamin D, a few minutes of morning sunlight, or a supplement because vitamin D receptors sit directly on muscle tissue and play a role in how efficiently your muscles use the protein you give them. The next item on this list isn't about what you eat at all. It's about a specific number that most people on these medications have never actually calculated for their own body weight. And getting it right changes everything downstream. Number 4, hitting your total daily protein target. Not just eating more protein in a vague sense. Most people have been told to increase protein without ever being given an actual number, so they nudge their intake up by 10 or 15 grams and assume they've solved the problem. They haven't. The research is specific here. A 2025 case series published in Sage Open Medicine followed 3 patients on semaglutide or tirzepatide who combined resistance training with protein intake between roughly 0.8 and 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. Their outcomes were dramatically different from each other. One patient still lost 6.9% of her lean tissue, while the other 2 actually gained lean tissue, up 2.5% and 5.8% respectively, despite losing 13 to 33% of their total body weight. The dividing line wasn't willpower, it was the number. Think of your daily protein target like the minimum deposit needed before a bank will approve a loan. You can make partial payments all week, but if you never hit the minimum, the loan in this case, permission for your body to keep building and maintaining muscle, never gets approved. Your body treats muscle tissue as expensive to maintain, and during a calorie deficit, if the protein deposit isn't there, muscle is the first asset it liquidates. This matters specifically for people on GLP-1 medications because these drugs work partly by slowing gastric emptying the rate at which food leaves your stomach, which is exactly why they curb appetite so effectively. But that same mechanism can make it physically harder to eat enough volume of food to reach a real protein target, even when you're trying. A man in his early 70s started tirzepatide and, like most patients, found his appetite dropping fast. He was eating maybe half of what he used to. Standing up from his recliner had started requiring a push from the armrests, and his doctor had attributed it to just getting older that happens after 70. The actual issue was that his protein intake had fallen from what used to be reasonably adequate to under 50 grams a day. Working out a daily target of around 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of his current body weight and building meals deliberately around that number rather than guessing brought his intake to around 90 to 100 grams a day. Several months later, he no longer needed to push off the armrest to stand. Tonight, do the math once. Take your weight in kilograms if you only know pounds, divide by 2.2 and multiply by 1.2. That's your floor for the day in grams of protein. Write it on a sticky note on the fridge. You don't need to hit it perfectly every day, but knowing the actual number instead of a vague sense of more changes how you build your plate. Pair this with item 5, spreading that total across 3 or 4 meals. Because the total number only helps if it's actually delivered in doses your body can use to trigger muscle building, rather than in one overwhelming meal your appetite can't handle anyway. The next item on the list is the one where the actual mechanical signal to your muscles comes from, and it's the piece most people on these medications skip entirely because nobody in a 15-minute visit has time to explain why it matters this much. If nobody has sat you down and explained what's actually happening to your muscle tissue while you lose weight on these medications, and what you can do about it, starting tonight, tap subscribe. Because that's exactly what this channel exists to do every week for free. Hit like if you learned something in the last few minutes your prescribing doctor never had time to mention. And if you know someone on Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, or Zepbound who's losing weight but hasn't thought about their muscle, send them this video today. Number 3, resistance training, at least 2 to 3 times a week, not cardio alone. Most people have been told that any movement is good movement. And while that's true for cardiovascular health, it's incomplete for muscle. Walking and cardio burn calories and support your heart, but they don't send a strong enough mechanical signal to your muscle fibers to convince your body to protect that tissue during a calorie deficit. Without that specific signal, your body has no reason to hold on to muscle it isn't being asked to use with force. Think of your muscle like a company deciding which employees to keep during a round of layoffs. If a department never gets called on to do difficult work, it looks expendable on paper, easy to cut. Resistance training is what puts that department back on active, essential duty, so it survives the cuts that come with rapid weight loss. This connects directly to something called sarcopenia, the age-related progressive loss of muscle mass and strength that already accelerates after age 60, independent of any medication. Roughly 30% of people over 60 have measurably reduced muscle strength, and rapid pharmaceutical weight loss layered on top of that natural decline is exactly why researchers have started paying close attention to muscle outcomes in older GLP-1 users specifically. A 2025 primer in the journal Circulation noted that reductions in lean mass are consistently reported across the major GLP-1 trials, with semaglutide associated with lean mass loss of up to 40% of total weight lost in some analyses, which is exactly why the medical research community is now actively studying how to counteract it, including trials evaluating muscle-preserving therapies alongside these drugs. A woman in her late 60s had been an enthusiastic daily walker for over a decade, several miles every morning regardless of weather. After starting semaglutide and losing close to 40 pounds, she noticed her walking pace hadn't changed, but carrying groceries up from the car had become surprisingly hard. Her prior explanation, from a different provider, had been that this was simply normal for her age. The change that mattered wasn't adding more walking. She was already walking plenty. It was adding 2 sessions a week of basic resistance work, body weight squats, wall push-ups, and light dumbbell rows. Within about 10 weeks, carrying the groceries stopped being a 2-trip job. Here's what this can look like tonight, even with no equipment. Stand in front of a sturdy chair, lower yourself down slowly until you're nearly sitting, then push back up through your heels. Do this 10 times. Your legs should feel a real, warm, burning sensation by the last few reps. That discomfort is not a warning sign here. It's the actual signal your muscle needs to receive to justify staying. The fact that it's uncomfortable is exactly why it works. Pair this with your protein target from item 4, timed within about 2 hours after training, because that's the window when your muscle is most receptive to using dietary protein for actual repair and growth. The mechanical signal from the exercise and the raw material from the protein work on the same repair pathway. The next item on this list isn't just do more of the last one, it's about a specific type of resistance training that produces dramatically different results than simply going through the motions. So far, you've learned that spacing your protein correctly, hitting a real daily target, and adding basic resistance training can meaningfully change how much muscle you keep. You could stop the video here and already be doing more than most people on these medications ever will. But item 2 is about a distinction inside resistance training itself, that most people never learn the difference between movement and an actual growth stimulus. And it's the difference that separated the patients in that case series who gained lean tissue from the one who still lost nearly 7% of hers. Number 2, progressive overload deliberately increasing the resistance, reps, or difficulty of your training over time, rather than repeating the same easy routine indefinitely. Most people who do start some resistance training assume that once they're doing the exercises, the box is checked. That assumption is costing them most of the benefit. Your muscle doesn't respond to exercise. In general, it responds to being asked to do something it currently finds difficult. Once a given weight or exercise stops being difficult, your body has no further reason to maintain the extra tissue it built to handle it, and on top of a calorie deficit from your medication, that tissue becomes an easy target to shed. Picture a violin string. Leave it slack, and it makes no sound no matter how many times you touch it. Tighten it just enough, and it resonates with a clear, specific pitch. Muscle works the same way. There's a threshold of tension it needs to feel before it responds by adapting, and once you're used to a given level, you have to tighten the string again to get the same response. This matters enormously for people in a calorie deficit from GLP-1 medication because of anabolic resistance. The same mechanism from item 5, your muscle needs a stronger stimulus than it used to, just to get a normal building response. A workout that would have been plenty of stimulus 5 years ago may simply not be enough signal now, especially while you're also eating less. A retired teacher had been doing the same set of light dumbbell exercises twice a week for nearly 2 years before starting tirzepatide, and had assumed that consistency alone would protect her muscle once she started losing weight. Her physician's first response to her fatigue was to check her thyroid, which came back normal. What actually mattered was that her workout, unchanged for 2 years, no longer represented any real challenge to her muscles. She was going through familiar motions, with no growth stimulus behind them. Adding small, deliberate increases every couple of weeks, one more rep, then slightly heavier dumbbells, then one additional set changed her trajectory measurably within 2 months, evident on her next grip strength check. Tonight, here's the practical version. Whatever resistance exercise you're already doing, do one more repetition than last time, or use a slightly heavier weight, or add 30 extra seconds under tension. It should feel genuinely harder by the final few reps, a slight trembling in the muscle, a real effort to complete the last one cleanly. That trembling is not something to avoid. It's the specific signal that tells your body this tissue is still needed. Pair this with item 3's timing training within roughly 48 hours of your last session for the same muscle group, because progressive overload only works if the stimulus is repeated with enough frequency for your body to keep responding to it, rather than being an occasional isolated challenge. The next and final item on this list isn't a fourth separate strategy. It's what happens when you stop treating these as separate strategies at all, and it's the single biggest lever the actual research has identified. Number 1, combining structured resistance training with an adequate, consistent protein intake, not as 2 optional add-ons, but as one integrated protocol, applied from the very start of treatment rather than added later as damage control. Most people have been told, if they're told anything at all, to try to exercise and eat protein as a loose general suggestion. That vague framing is costing people the majority of the muscle they didn't have to lose. The research is specific and, frankly, striking. In cohorts of GLP-1 users who did not deliberately combine resistance training with adequate protein, lean mass losses in the 26 to 40% range of total weight lost were common, mirroring the STEP trial findings. In groups that combined structured resistance training several days a week with protein intake in the 1.6 to 2.2 gram per kilogram range, muscle loss dropped to under 10% of total weight lost. Not a typo, the same medication in comparable populations produced roughly 4 times less muscle loss when the 2 strategies were combined deliberately rather than pursued half-heartedly or separately. Think of it like a car with all-wheel drive. Protein alone is like fuel with no engine turning. The raw material sits there without a mechanical reason to be used. Resistance training alone is like an engine running on fumes. The mechanical signal is there, but there isn't enough raw material to actually build anything in response. It's only when both systems engage together that the car actually moves, and it's only when protein and resistance training happen together that your body reliably chooses to preserve and rebuild muscle instead of simply burning it for fuel during the deficit. This is where anabolic resistance, sarcopenia, and the appetite-suppressing effect of these medications all intersect at once. GLP-1 drugs create the calorie deficit and blunt your food intake. Aging muscle needs a bigger stimulus to respond at all, and without both a strong mechanical signal and a big enough protein dose arriving together, your body defaults to treating muscle as the easiest tissue to sacrifice. Combining the two doesn't just add their individual benefits, it appears to compound them, because the mechanical signal from training increases how efficiently your muscle actually uses the protein you eat afterward. Consider a man in his late 60s who started semaglutide primarily to manage his blood sugar, and initially did nothing differently with his diet or activity beyond eating less. Over 4 months, he lost weight steadily, but his usual explanation for feeling unsteady on the stairs from an earlier doctor had simply been diabetic nerve changes without further investigation. When he restructured his routine around 3 weekly resistance sessions and a daily protein target near 1.6 grams per kilogram, treating the two as a single non-negotiable pairing rather than separate optional habits, his stair-climbing steadiness and grip strength both improved over the following months, even as his weight continued to drop. Here's what starting this tonight actually looks like. Lay out tomorrow's meals in advance, even roughly, so you know where your protein is coming from before appetite suppression makes decisions harder later in the day. Set a specific day and time for your first resistance session this week, the same way you'd set an appointment, because whenever I get to it quietly becomes never on these medications. And do the resistance training before eating your largest protein-containing meal of the day, where possible, not after, so the mechanical signal is already primed when the protein arrives. Pair this final item with everything before it: the protein distribution from item 5, the daily total from item 4, the base resistance training from item 3, and the progressive overload from item 2, because the number one item is really just what happens when all 4 are applied together with intention, rather than in isolation. What we've covered today isn't about looking better in a photograph, though that matters to people too. It's about whether you're still the one carrying your own groceries, climbing your own stairs, and getting yourself up out of a chair without help 5 or 10 years from now. The research is clear that muscle loss on these medications isn't inevitable. It's a consequence of how the weight loss is managed, and that part is largely in your hands. Starting tonight, calculate your daily protein target using your current body weight and aim for at least 1.2 grams per kilogram, more if you're already resistance training. Pick a body weight or light resistance exercise you can do right now without equipment and do 1 set before bed. Set a real day and time on your calendar this week for your first or next resistance session, rather than leaving it open-ended, and store a batch of hard-boiled eggs or a container of Greek yogurt at eye level in the fridge, not the back on an appetite-suppressed day. What you see first is often what you actually eat. If you have chronic kidney disease, talk to your doctor before significantly increasing your protein intake, since elevated protein loads can place additional strain on already compromised kidneys, and your target needs to be set individually rather than using the general ranges discussed here. A lot of you are going to notice your energy dipping hard in the afternoons on these medications, even when your weight loss is going well and your protein and training are on track. There's a specific reason blood sugar and appetite suppression interact to cause that afternoon crash, and a straightforward way to prevent it. I made a video walking through exactly what's happening and how to fix it. I'll link it right here. Have you noticed any change in your strength, stamina, or balance since starting a GLP-1 medication? And if you've already added resistance training or adjusted your protein, has it made a difference? Tell me in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else watching this right now needs to hear.